Hi, it's Lerald. In this video, I'm going to give an update to my Earthshatter Berserker. It's been a few days, and you know what? This build still absolutely shreds. It is the strongest League starter I have ever played. It has killed Uber bosses, cleared tier 17 maps, and run in-game farming strategies on a budget. It's definitely not as fast-moving as Toxic Rain Pathfinder. That's kind of the big disadvantage. It doesn't have the smoothness, the consistency that Toxic Rain does, but in terms of damage, I'm doing over 30 million. I am shredding Uber bosses. This build is rocking and rolling, and honestly, considering how much damage it has, it's still kind of tanky. It feels very strong all around. I really love it. I have had no regrets with starting Melee this league. Now I'm going to get into some updates, answer some commonly asked questions, and give a small gear crafting guide. But first, please like and subscribe if you find this video helpful. Alright, so as I've said, I have killed some Ubers. Not all of them. It's not a problem. I definitely can do that. They're easy. They're not difficult. They're just expensive and generally unrewarding. It's sort of like flushing currency down the toilet, so I would rather spend that time and currency doing more difficult content than Ubers, such as tier 17’s and actually making currency, which, I mean, yeah, they're still harder than Uber bosses and more rewarding. I don't know why, but it is what it is. I have cleared all the tier 17’s multiple times. I've been doing a lot of in-game farming. I feel that the build has mostly reached its in-game potential. It could definitely go further. I mean, I could add a Headhunter or a Mage Blood onto it, and maybe I will, but definitely the build has hit the point where all the content that is reasonable in the game is doable without much difficulty, even without any tier 0 uniques. So it's confirmed, Slam Berserker is a good league start build. Hilarious to think, but it really is good all around. I'm very happy with it. It owns. The only thing that I really miss from Toxic Rain Pathfinder is the speed, which is, you know, I would definitely have made a lot more currency in the first week and a half of the league if I had been going faster, even if I were doing half as much damage. But that's fine, I don't care, right? What do I need the currency for? Certainly not to clear everything. Now, I have made the swap over to Echoes of Creation. I can show that off here. That's Ben's helmet. For those who don't know, Ben is basically the Leo Messi and Michael Jordan of this game. He's the best in the game by far. He wins all of the various races that GGG has on hardcore, and this is a helmet that he made as a reward for winning one of those races at one point. And what it does is it more or less turns your slam builds into Bone Shatter. Technically speaking, you can use it with any exertable attack, but really it is more oriented towards slams. It also puts me into the like 30 million DPS range without too much effort or a god tier weapon, which is pretty fantastic. Now, I have added in a relatively inexpensive Flesh and Flame Jewel setup in my passive tree as well. If I can find them, here we go. I'm using Unbreakable from the Juggernaut Ascendancy to compensate for the self-inflicted damage that comes from this helm, and it works really well. I'll kind of talk about the helm here. It gives you a second cooldown use on socketed Warcry skills, which I have Enduring Cry and Seismic Cry in there. It just kind of helps with quality of life to have 2 cooldowns on those. It gives you a bit of armor and life, that's whatever. It actually is kind of a low amount of life compared to rares now. This is something that a lot of people have pointed out, that uniques will now need to have their life values tuned back up because rare items have had massive increases to their life, and that has kind of devalued a lot of uniques. But the real money here is that this helm makes it so that when you attack, if you have any Warcries exerting the attack, and you can have multiple Warcries exerting any attack, you will take 16%, it's 15 to 20% of your life as fizz damage for each Warcry. Now this is fizz damage, so you can mitigate it through all of the normal mitigation methods, armor, converting fizz damage into elemental damage, lots of different ways to reduce that, and you do want to low roll on this because obviously it can add up to a lot. Like if I just kind of show off here, oh, I don't have a skill socketed to attack with. You can see my health is kind of tickling down a little bit, and then I'm regenning life to compensate. But obviously this means if you have a whole bunch of Warcries, 5, 6 Warcries exerting an attack, you can hit yourself for your full health pool unless you have armor to mitigate it. This is why I don't really love running Blue Altars this league, is I'm taking a lot of physical damage. Blue Altars like to throw reduced physical mitigation at you as a regular debuff, and that's insanely bad for this. Now the upside is that your skills will have, again, 10 to 15% more damage. It's a range. I have kind of mid on the damage and low on the damage taken. for each Warcry exerting them. So if you're at the minimum roll and you have 5 Warcries, that's a 50% more damage multiplier. If you're on the higher end and you have 5 Warcries, it's a 75% more damage multiplier. And you can see how this is just a god tier helm for any sort of exertion Warcry build, which is what this build is all about. Now, just to kind of jump into the PoB here and show this off, you have a couple of options from Flesh and Flame Jewels and the Juggernaut Ascendancy that really help with making this helm a lot more wearable. I think a thing that a lot of people have gone with is Untiring. It has, the main thrust of this is that it gives you a pretty substantial amount of life regen based on physical damage that you've prevented from hits. It's not really represented in PoB because that's just something that's difficult to represent, but it effectively works like Recoup, but a much, much, much stronger version of Recoup. It's really good. The problem with Untiring Jewels is that they're very expensive. When I looked, a pair of Untiring Jewels was over 50 divines just for those 2 jewels. That's very, very high. I went with Unbreakable, which makes it so that your armor from your body armor is doubled, and then it also applies 15% of your armor to chaos damage from hits. I am not chaos res capped. I think I'm at 12 chaos res, and not really all that close. I was previously getting a lot of chaos res from rare jewels, but with switching to Flesh and Flame, well, you know, you're not going to get any stats from Flesh and Flame. You're just getting a notable passive from another Ascendancy. And ultimately, I think that this actually does help a lot with mitigating a lot of that chaos damage. It really, really helps a lot. But more importantly, I have just a very, very high body armor in terms of like armor value. It's over 3k base armor value. And so then doubling that is really, really significant. You can see that like just by unsocketing this, I would lose about 16% of my max hit, about 5k max hit. That's pretty big. Now there are some other options here. You could take Unflinching. That is an option as well. Generally, it's more expensive because it makes it so that you get another max endurance charge and you have just a much easier time generating endurance charges. And then Unrelenting is also an option for Flesh and Flame Jewels if you're playing a Berserker. All of these are good to steal from Juggernaut. Juggernaut's a great Ascendancy. It just doesn't really add any damage to this build at all, which is why I ultimately chose to go Berserker. Super damage oriented, and then we can build the whole rest of the build around being tanky, pretty much. I did think about doing Unstoppable to be stun, immune, and like chill, freeze, immune effectively. And ultimately, I just didn't want to go that route because that would still leave me having to figure out all of the defensive issues. And Unbreakable really was just like a cheat code, an immediate cheat code to figure out my defensive issues with the build. I have also added in this Timeless Jewel, Glorious Vanity, because it swaps the nearby keystone to Immortal Ambition. This is a Glorious Vanity sacrificed in the name of Ahwana. I have not gone for any kind of special number or anything. Like all of the small passives that are in the radius are worthless. But the point of Immortal Ambition is just simply that it gives you Slayer Overleach, and that's really, really valuable. Being able to permanently Overleach has really helped a lot with staying sustained while doing all this self-damage. Permanently able to self-sustain, it's really, really good. It definitely has made me feel significantly tankier, even though it did cost, it cost a couple of points to come out here, and it cost Immortal Ambition. And then also we're not able to use our Amulet Anoint on Bastion Breaker, so we kind of have to get hits have a chance to avoid or ignore enemy physical damage reduction through other means, which we do that. But ultimately, like, there's a lot of sacrifices you have to make for this to work, but it is worth all of them. Jumping back in game, I have also gotten Elemental Ailment Immune with a Storm Shroud, and that is part of how I've gotten that Ignore Enemy PDR. I got that as a Storm Shroud Corrupt. Doesn't have to be on the Storm Shroud, it can be on anything, and you don't even have to have it. It just is nice for making it so that no enemies are ever able to ignore your physical damage at all. I get some of that from Gloves, 38% from Gloves, which I only need 35, 15% from a Jewel Corruption, and then the other 50% comes from a Cluster Jewel, notable right here, Iron Breaker, over 100% chance to ignore enemy PDR, so no enemies are ever able to mitigate my damage ever. Makes it a lot easier in terms of running various map mods or taking like Eldritch Altar mods that give enemies 100,000 armor. They still have 0 as far as I'm concerned. Now, as I said, I am Elemental Ailment Immune. I have made a video about how to do that, how to craft up these boots, and I mean, that is literally what I did. I bought some Fractured Move Speed boots. I slammed them with, I believe it's Essence of Torment, until I had a life value that I was happy with, and then that was pretty much that for the boots and for ailments in general. I have switched over to using a gold flask as one of my flasks. I'm using a basalt and a granite flask with reduced effective curses and chance to avoid being stunned, and then a quicksilver flask with increased armor. And then my fourth utility flask has been kind of a rotating option depending on what kind of content I'm doing. So I have a whole host of them set up here. Previously, I was using a basalt flask with move speed on it, and then I was getting chance to avoid being stunned from my defensive utility flask, but I've kind of shifted around to getting that chance to avoid being stunned from a different flask, and then using gold flask for when I'm just like map juicing, map farming, get more rarity on the suffix as well, crafted suffix, and that just makes it so you get a lot more gold, you get a lot more stuff from monsters, so that's been really helpful. And then depending on, like, if I'm bossing, doing some kind of more difficult content, if I'm fighting, say, Exarch, then I would use a ruby flask, get fire res, and give myself, instead of chance to avoid being stunned, craft life regen per second as that suffix, you know, or use the rarity suffix. I mean, that could also work fine. Give yourself a little bit more stuff. I really like the chance, or the generate charges when you're hit by an enemy as a prefix. I like that as the prefix on any flask that I'm using when I'm not using either a Mage Blood or playing a Pathfinder, just to have more uptime on flasks in situations where you're not able to kill enemies and generate charges normally. Basically, you know, Exarch, fire damage, I'll use Ruby Flask. Cold damage, or like, I don't know, Elder Shaper, I'll use Sapphire Flask, and then anything that deals lightning damage, Topaz Flask, just kind of rotate those around. But I would say 90% of the time, I'm using Gold Flask. And then, you know, a normal instant recovery on low health, and bleed immune life flask. That's my preferred approach for life flasks on anything that's not a Pathfinder. Okay, so I have had some FAQs, some commonly asked questions I kind of want to answer. So the first one is, why use Earthshatter instead of Ground Slam, or why not Earthshatter of Prominence? So I have been using the primary, just standard Earthshatter, and you know, the way Earthshatter works, just to kind of give that like brief rundown, is that when you slam the ground, it'll send out some spikes, and then when you either Warcry or use a different slam, it will then shatter all those spikes and deal damage. So if you're in a cramped area and you're near a wall or whatever, all the spikes can kind of stack up all in one spot. In this area is actually not a great place to show that off. Let's see if I can run to like Blood Aqueducts or something, kind of get near a wall. Yeah, this is working okay. But they will kind of stack up on each other and then shotgun an enemy, and that can dramatically increase your damage. And this means that Earthshatter can actually have much, much, much higher DPS than the likes of Ground Slam, of Earthshaking, which I like, or Earthshatter of Prominence. Earthshatter of Prominence makes it so that you just summon one giant spike instead of a bunch of little spikes that are capable of shotgunning. And so, like, just to show off a little Earthshatter of Prominence here, you know, it works. It definitely works. It's okay. It just doesn't have the insane possible upside. It's sort of better in the worst case scenario and much worse in the best case scenarios. And so I did play around with it. I wasn't all that thrilled. And then as you can really see, it's just like, it just doesn't give you nearly as much AoE clear as you would get out of a regular Earthshatter, where regular Earthshatter is kind of filling the area up with lots of stuff to explode. And Earthshatter of Prominence just simply doesn't do that. It's much more single target focused, but then if you really want to maximize your single target damage, you're better off running regular Earthshatter and trying to get enemies near walls and kind of shotgun them with all of those Earthshatter explosions. Or if they're a big enemy, you don't even need to get them near a wall, like if it's the boss of Fortress map, the giant robot, you can just slam right on his face and all the spikes will spawn around him and then you explode and they all hit him. So for larger enemies, you don't even need to do any sort of wall shenanigans in order to shotgun them with all of the projectiles. Now, Ground Slam of Earthshaking is just a skill that people really like. It just has a big frontal cone. It's really effective. The only real problem I have with it is it just doesn't do as much damage as Earthshatter once you get everything set up. And it also has a lot slower attack speed. Come on, shout me up to full. All right. 49 rage, we're at full. So 0.52 attacks per second, or I should say 0.52 attack time. So less than 2 attacks per second. Whereas Earthshatter is 0.46. The attack speed is pretty noticeable. I have found that the attack speed was pretty noticeable anyway. And then again, the damage difference is just quite substantial. Ground Slam does a lot less damage than Earthshatter. even though it has some value, some quality of life to it, being able to just do like a frontal cone, that difference in attack speed is pretty significant. All right, now I think the next thing to talk about is shout staggering. Now, this is something that doesn't work in your hideout. They made it so that if you have auto exertion active, it just doesn't shout in your hideout at all. This is a welcome change. This is something that was requested after last league where people were constantly shouting in their hideouts and it was driving them crazy. But it does mean that it's kind of hard to tell stuff if you're sitting around in your hideout, you're trying to like gauge why your shouts aren't working. That would be why you're in your hideout and they don't work there. In order to make Earthshatter function correctly, you kind of want all of your shouts to be staggered from each other. You don't want them to all have the same cooldown, and so getting quality on your war cries is what reduces their cooldown. That's the only thing. Having increased levels just makes them stronger, makes the buff stronger, but because you're using auto exertion support, you don't get any buffs, you just get them to automate the war cry, period. So you get cooldown reduction from increasing the quality on auto exertion and increasing the quality on all of your war cries. So in order to stagger them so that they are like perpetually desynced from each other and kind of always popping your Earthshatter spikes as soon as they come out, what you want to do is you want to have different quality levels on all of your gems. They don't have to be staggered significantly. Like I have this random one that I found, this random rallying cry that I found that has 22 quality on it. Perfect. Then I have a 15 quality infernal cry, a 20 quality intimidating cry, a 13 quality battle mages cry, and that pretty much takes care of all of my war cries being staggered enough to like permanently be popping all of the spikes. Like if we look at the cooldowns of all the skills, it's like 3.05 on rallying, 3.23 on infernal, 3.1 on intimidating, 3.28 on battle mages, so all desynced from each other. All right, now maybe the biggest question that I've seen is how do you make Echoes of Creation work? And more specifically, how do you make it so that you're not just instantly killing yourself by using this? And there are a couple of ways. I mean, I think the main one, as I kind of demonstrated with my Flesh and Flame Jewel, is just really to get a lot of armor from your body armor, which I have done that. I have a body armor that has a pretty high life roll and then increased armor and flat armor, and then also Fizz DR suffix. All of these are really good, and this is kind of what you're looking for, is just a ton of armor. Like sitting around in my hideout with no buffs active at all, I have like 30,000 armor just flat, and then I also have endurance charges. I have 5 endurance charges as my cap. You can get more. Enduring Cry will generate those endurance charges for you. We've got a lot of stuff going on in this build. We can generate endurance charges when we hit ourselves, thanks to Inexorable. We also have increased armor when we're standing still, and we're always standing still whenever we attack, so that helps a lot. We have a war cry that makes it so that our war cries, we have a war cry mastery, I should say, that makes all of our war cries have a minimum of 10 power, and then we have a rage mastery that makes it so our war cries generate rage per enemy power, and then we also have this notable that makes it so that our rage increases our armor. So we're kind of always rocking a lot of armor and full rage all the time. So that really helps a bunch. All of the endurance charges help a bunch, and we're generally just very tanky against physical damage because of all of this. Now, there are other options as well. There is Leech, which I've already talked about. The Leech, the constant Slayer Overleech we get from Immortal Ambition helps a lot. The Fizz taken as Ellie as a chest implicit helps a lot. The Gruthkul Minor Pantheon, which I'm not spec'd into at the moment, but that also really helps a lot. That can give you an extra 5% additional Fizz DR. This is probably the best default option, but for any time where I'm going to deal with a monster's poison on hit, Soul of Shikari is really good. Shakira. I like that a lot on any poison on hit map mods. That is very helpful. And that is kind of the main stuff that I am using to really like deal with the Fizz damage that I'm doing to myself. The Slayer Overleech is like truly the kind of secret sauce that makes all of this really work super well. Now, in terms of stun immunity, this is something I've also seen. I'm just not stun immune. I am getting some chance to avoid being stunned from a flask, but that's not always up. Seismic Cry increases both your armor and your stun avoidance. Where is it in here? Increases your stun threshold per 5 power, so you do get a lot of increased stun threshold and more armor, both of which help a lot, but you don't have 100% uptime on Seismic Cry. You don't have 100% uptime on that flask. And, you know, there's some other stuff in the tree that helps. We just have a lot of health. We have warrior blood truly runs through my veins, giving increased stun threshold. But ultimately, sometimes I just get stunned and die, which is what happened against Uber Shaper a couple of times and why that fight was kind of sloppy. You know, sometimes I die. I've just come to accept it at this point. All right, now mana problems were another thing that was asked about. Most of this is really just fixed through this node here, attack mana cost and cannibalistic right. We do also take the mana mastery that gives us increased mana reservation efficiency of skills. And then there's one other thing here, the life mastery that makes your skills cost life instead of 15% of mana cost. These help a ton. Now, prior to using the Echoes of Creation, you can use reduced mana cost of attacks as a Helm implicit, an Eldritch Helm implicit Searing Exarch, and that helps a lot. Ultimately, you're gonna have to use non-channeling skills have minus mana cost on your jewelry. That's pretty basic. You just craft it on and then that's it. And now mana's a real, like a non-factor. It does help to have mana leech somewhere in the tree. You can get this on a rare jewel, which I think is what I've done. Yeah, I have it on this jewel. A bit of stats, chaos res, and fizz attack damage leeched as mana. Now, one other change I've made from the previous video, I think, is I've dropped a bit of dexterity. The only thing I needed 155 dex for was level 20 blood rage, so I just de-leveled my blood rage. I only lost like 2% attack speed. Not noticeable, not a big deal at all. Another thing that I have changed is vulnerability versus punishment. I have used both of these as the curse that you hook up to Battle Mage's Cry, so it'll auto curse on hit. Vulnerability is about the same as punishment. Vulnerability gives you increased physical damage on enemies all the time. Punishment gives you increased damage on low life enemies. They roughly average out to be about the same level of a damage increase. Punishment also gives you debilitate on enemies when they hit you. That's 20% less move speed and 10% less damage. This is really good. It's really, really good to run punishment. I recommend it for any sort of difficult content or just the majority of the time that you're doing stuff. The only problem with it is that you can run into things that'll reflect curses, Eldritch mods, for example, and then that means you're gonna have debilitate on you, giving you less move speed and less damage, and that is very annoying. Whereas vulnerability, that's just extra damage taken, you can live with that. So I've gone back to vulnerability just for kind of quality of life while mapping, but you can swap those out either way depending on the content you're doing. I do think punishment is better for tough stuff. All right, I've also been asked about leveling. I've made several videos about this build already. I did talk about leveling. I used Ground Slam to level initially, then I switched to Sunder. I set up auto exertion support, or auto exertion and several war cries as soon as I could get them up. Ultimately, I just tried to keep a big axe on hand while leveling the whole time, and it really was probably the simplest leveling experience I've ever had in PoE. You just slam with Sunder for a while until you get to maps. It really is just unga bunga throughout the campaign. It only became more complex and thoughtful once I reached maps, and initially I was running Ground Slam for a while, but once I decided to swap over to Earthshatter, and then I felt like I needed to stagger out the auto-exerted war cries, that was a little bit more complex, but, you know, I've explained it, and you're just trying to constantly trigger Earthshatter explosions with those war cries. That's it. Finally, I have changed my Anoint because of setting up this Timeless Jewel down here. I have changed my Anoint to Admonisher, which gives you a lot of Warcry speed, which is like good quality of life for the couple of ones that you self-cast. But more importantly, it gives you increased damage for each time you've Warcried recently. And because all of my Warcries have under 4 seconds as their cooldown time, I've used all of them within the last 4 seconds, or at least all of the automated ones, and that would be Rallying Cry, Infernal Cry, Intimidating Cry, and Battle Mage's Cry. So I always have at a minimum 4 war cries recently, and the thing is, it just says for each time you've war cried, not each time you've cast one, so the triggered war cries do count. So this is a 60% increased damage mod at minimum, potentially going up to 90% if you've cast Seismic Cry and Enduring Cry within the last 4 seconds as well. Pretty insane. Really, really strong Anoint, better than anything you could possibly get in the tree, really. The only other option I would say that's competitive maybe is Tenacity, which is a hidden one. It's off the tree. It requires a Prismatic and 2 Goldens, so it is wildly expensive. It gives you 5% increased max life and Transfiguration of Body, so 30% of your increases and reductions to max life will apply to attack damage. If you're going super, super, super tanky, maybe this can be competitive. It certainly is more defensively valuable, but generally speaking, it is less damage. Like if I mouse over Admonisher, I don't think I have any War Cries cast recently in my set up here. There we go. 4 war cries cast recently. We'll assume the low end, only 4 as opposed to 6, which is maybe more realistic for the starts of some fights. So I would get about 7% more damage out of tenacity, and I would lose like 9.5% damage out of Admonisher. And then again, that's sort of the floor value. If we go to maximum value, it's more like 14. So huge damage gain, obviously. Okay, another question, maybe the last of the commonly asked questions, is how do you get the damage to show up correctly for Earthshatter? And the way that you do this is, like, if you just have it the normal setup, it'll just show the count of 1, and that'll show 6 million DPS from the initial impact and 4.5 million damage from the spike. Seems bad. The thing is that there are 6 spikes, and so you want to count 6 and then click the include in full DPS value and then scroll down and look. That's like 25 million DPS, but that also, you want to include the initial hit. The problem with this, the kind of weird wonky bit about the using count, is you want to include just one initial hit. You're not hitting 6 times with the initial hit. So the initial hit is like 6 million DPS, and then you have to then turn on the count and then just kind of eyeball this and then look at the spike value, about 25 million from the spikes, and then about 6 million from the initial hit. That's about 31 million DPS or so. And yeah, I mean, that's a lot of damage. Like I said, this has been shredding tier 17s and Ubers. Definitely very good, even if PoB numbers make it look like it does 4 million DPS. I assure you, it does not. All right, now I want to talk a bit about gear crafting, and I'm just going to kind of go piece by piece. We did make a whole video about crafting up an axe, crafting a good axe. This is the axe I'm using currently. It's a 1050 DPS axe. It's really not anything complicated. You know, I'll start with this. I did just start with a fractured attack speed base, and then all I did was I slammed it with deafening essences of contempt to lock in, to guarantee a good flat fizz roll, and then all I was looking for was either a high percentage physical damage roll or a high percentage fizz and accuracy prefix, and I got that hybrid fizz accuracy prefix, and so then I just crafted the bench craft increased physical damage roll on there, and then I just slapped it with a couple of exalted orbs that did very poorly for me. And I crafted 25% increased physical damage with the Settlers of Kalgur. I don't remember which runes they are, power runes I want to say, but like there's an enchant there, and I got it up to 25% increased fizz damage, and now this is a 1050 fizz DPS axe. Not really all that complicated. You know, it took a lot of essences. I think I bought a couple hundred essences, and it took about this long to get it up to this level. I did do another version of this earlier where I did the exact same methods. I just got lower rolls, and I used that for a while. I used that all the way up through all of the tier 17s and my first Uber boss. And that axe only had like 830 DPS or something on. It was just lower rolls in this, not any different crafting method. And ultimately I sold that one off to somebody else and crafted up this axe, and I've been using this for a while. If I wanted to go higher, ultimately I would do the same process. I would just use essence crafting, but go until I get even better rolls. That's pretty much it. Now, as for the helm that I'm currently using, there's really not anything to this, right? This is a unique, it drops like it is, and they're pretty common. They're not very expensive. Prior to this, I did use this helm. This is, I think, just a helm that I got from the League mechanic. It just has a high life roll, pretty decent armor, and resistance roll on it, but like a couple of dead rolls on it, nothing great. And then the Searing Exarch implicit is good, really helps with mana. The Eater of Worlds implicit to give reduced life regen on enemies is just helpful for doing like Maven stuff, make it so that she can't heal enemies back to full easily. That was all there really was to that. So the body armor is something that I got from the League mechanic. It was just a generically well-rolled body armor, but if I wanted to do this same like craft with a body armor, let's say I wanted to make another body armor just like this, I would just use Deafening Essences of Greed on a random body armor. You could buy one that's fractured that has like an increased armor or a flat armor roll on it, or maybe a fractured additional Fizz DR roll on it. You could check for fractured life as well and just see, you know, that's probably going to be more expensive than the increased armor fractures. And ultimately, I would just roll with Deafening Essences of Greed, because that is basically a tier 2 life roll. I would just roll until I was happy with the stats on it, and then that would pretty much be it. Set up the implicits, I like the Eater of Worlds Fizz taken as an element. That's good. Elemental damage, you know, that's good. And then the Searing Exarch Implicit that gives max all res is really, really strong. As for the gloves, you can see what I did here. I bought a fractured pair of gloves with a decent armor base on them, and I just rolled them with greed essences. Again, deafening essences of greed until I got an attack speed roll. Didn't have to settle for an attack speed roll. I really would like to have an armor roll on that prefix instead of that life leech, because I get all the life leech I already need from Blood Rage. But you know, that's fine. Ultimately, I finished off by crafting increased damage while leeching. That is a pretty decent damage increase, so I went with that. And then the implicits, I have gone with Ignore Enemy Fizz DR and increased attack speed. Just good quality of life on both of those. Never going to have my damage mitigated by any enemies. As for the boots, I have already mentioned these in a previous, kind of made a whole previous video about it, but you know, yeah, fractured move speed, slap them with deafening essences of torment until I'm happy with the rolls on them, craft a hybrid chaos resist on there, throw some implicits on there that seem all right from Eldritch Currency, pretty simple. This neck is just one that I bought. Ultimately, you know, I was just looking to kind of fill in some stats, fill in some resistances. It doesn't really have anything all that fancy going on other than the T1 life. I think this costs like 50 chaos or less. You know, you could craft this. I think you would probably be best off trying to craft it with like a deafening essence of spite or deafening essence of sorrow, something that gives you a bunch of a single stat. Just do that until you get a life roll and maybe some decent resistances. You're really just looking to get a prefix that you can craft non-channeling skills, have minus mana cost on. Don't really need anything fancy on the neck at all. Do make sure to anoint Admonisher though. As for the rings, I think it's the same boat. I think, again, I just like bought a ring that was, I think this might have even come from the boat. I did need dexterity, so that was helpful. But ultimately, just a decent life roll, some resistances and dex, who just kind of filled in the things that I had a need for. And then more importantly, non-channeling skills, minus mana cost, very good. Also, rarity this league is actually a useful stat, so having it on a piece or two is not a bad thing. You know, I wouldn't mind having it on something like instead of the life leech, rarity would be useful there. You know, rarity would be useful instead of the 1.3 life per second on this body armor. That would be useful as well. The same goes for this ring, right? It's just a ring that, like, it just is a ring that dropped. I think this one did come from ROG crafting, just sort of a random ring. It's got a lot of life. It's got some resistances. It was something I could craft non-channeling skills, have minus mana cost on. Really not any more complicated than that. All right, so now as for the belt, I think the way to do this is, there's really two ways. You could do essences, which maybe is good, or you could do harvest, reforge. So if we look at the belt in pathofexile, there are actually a lot of life rolls. You know, if we want life and chaos res, which is what I was looking for, there's a lot of possible life rolls, and like flask life recovery rate, life per second. These are kind of bad, and they're gonna really compete with just like regular flat life. But there's only one chaos roll, and that is chaos resistance. So you can just do the harvest bench chaos reforge. This is pretty cheap, and it'll guarantee one of these mod tiers of the chaos resistance. And so you would just spam that until you got a life value that you were happy with. And that might not take too long. That might not be too bad. Ultimately, you would want to do that until you either have a suffix or a null until you're able to have a suffix to craft Workrise Can't Exert travel skills. That would work. Now there is, of course, another option, and that's just deafening essences of envy. Those guarantee chaos res on a belt, and so you could slap that onto a belt as well to guarantee chaos res. That's right here, chaos res. Wow, that's so small. All right, let's take a look here in game. Deafening essence of envy, 31 to 35 chaos res if used on a belt. So you could just slam those on a belt for a while until you got a life roll that you were happy with, and then craft on Workrise Can't Exert travel skills. Pretty much the same approach either way. So yeah, ultimately all of this gear is, pretty basic gear. There's really not anything super complicated about any of it. The only thing that I would say is like kind of fancy is the axe, and that's really only just a thing that I made through spamming essences on it for a while. I could definitely make a better one by doing the same process, but just continuing until I got a higher roll. And that probably is what I would do if I were like looking to push this build into deep delving or something, trying to get like a 1400 DPS axe instead of a 1050 DPS axe. But where it is right now, with the amount of damage that it is doing to Ubers and tier 17 bosses at this point, I don't really feel that I need a better axe. I may still make one, but again, don't feel that I need anything better than I have right now in order to smash everything that this game really has to offer. Okay, hopefully this helps if you're looking to keep progressing this build, or if you're interested in playing it but maybe a bit on the fence about whether you should play it. Yes, you absolutely should. I highly recommend it. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.